What if the Bible really describes a race of giants who lived before Noah's flood? Not fairy tale giants, not cartoon monsters, not creatures from a fantasy movie, but real figures, mentioned in one of the strangest passages in Genesis, standing at the edge of the world before the flood. Genesis gives us only 4 verses. 4. That is all. 4 verses about the sons of God, the daughters of men, the Nephilim, and the mighty men of old. And then the Bible moves on. No full explanation. No height chart. No family tree. No detailed origin story. Just enough mystery to make you stop and ask the question: who were the Nephilim really? Were they the offspring of fallen angels? Were they the corrupted line of Seth? Were they ancient warrior kings whose power made them seem larger than life? Or were they truly giants? To answer that, we have to go back. Before Israel. Before Moses. Before Abraham. Before the ark. Back to the world before the flood. The Bible does not introduce the Nephilim in a peaceful world. It introduces them in a world that is already collapsing. It begins in Eden. Adam and Eve hear the voice of God in the garden. The world is whole. No grave has been dug. No blood has touched the ground. No brother has ever killed another brother. Then comes the serpent. Then comes the fruit. Then comes hiding. Then comes blame. And once sin enters the human story, Genesis shows you how fast it spreads. The first child born outside Eden is Cain. Think about that. The first baby born into the human story grows up to become the first murderer. Cain kills his brother Abel in a field. The first death in the Bible is not old age. It is murder. That matters because Genesis is not building toward a monster story. It is building toward a world where the human heart is falling apart. After Cain, people build cities. They make tools. They create music. Civilization rises. But the heart does not heal. You can build a city and still carry murder in your bones. You can make music and still refuse the voice of God. You can learn to shape bronze and iron and still not know how to rule your own soul. Then comes Seth. After Abel dies, Adam and Eve have another son. Through Seth's line, hope continues. People begin to call on the name of the Lord. Names like Enoch, Methuselah, and Noah appear. For a moment, it feels like the story may turn. But the shadow keeps growing. Humanity multiplies. Desire multiplies. Violence multiplies. And then Genesis brings us to the edge of the flood. The earth is corrupt. The earth is filled with violence. Not touched by violence. Not interrupted by violence. Filled with it. And right there, at the threshold of judgment, Genesis gives us the mystery. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful. They took wives for themselves. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days. And also afterward. These were the mighty men of old. The men of renown. That is the passage. And it has troubled readers for thousands of years. Here's what most people miss. The mystery of the Nephilim is not just a mystery about giants. It is a mystery about power. The sons of God saw. Then they took. Those words should sound familiar. In Eden, Eve saw that the fruit was desirable, and she took. Now in Genesis 6, the sons of God see the daughters of men, and they take. Genesis is showing you a pattern. Desire breaks away from obedience. Power breaks away from holiness. What looks beautiful becomes something seized, possessed, controlled. This is not romance. This is not a harmless marriage note. This is not a small detail in an old genealogy. This is a warning. Something has gone terribly wrong. So who are the sons of God? That is where the debate begins. There are three major views. The first is the most dramatic. The sons of God were fallen heavenly beings. The daughters of men were human women. And the Nephilim were connected to a forbidden union between heaven and earth. This view is ancient. It was not invented by the internet. Many ancient Jewish readers believed Genesis 6 described a supernatural rebellion. One reason is that similar language, sons of God, appears in places like Job, where heavenly beings stand before the Lord. That makes many readers look at Genesis 6 and say, maybe these sons of God are not human men. Maybe they are heavenly beings. Then there is the result. The Nephilim are not introduced like ordinary children. Genesis does not simply say, and they had sons and daughters. It says the Nephilim were on the earth, and they were connected with the mighty men of old, the men of renown. That sounds larger than an ordinary family problem. An ancient Jewish book called First Enoch expands this idea into a full story. First Enoch is not scripture for most Christians, and we should not treat it like Genesis, but it does show how ancient readers understood this mystery. In First Enoch, heavenly beings called Watchers descend on Mount Hermon. They desire human women. They bind themselves together with an oath. Figures like Semiaza and Azazel appear. Forbidden knowledge spreads. Violence grows. Giants are born. The world becomes corrupted. You can see why this view is so gripping. It explains why Genesis 6 feels so strange. It explains why the flood follows so soon afterward. It explains why the passage feels like more than ordinary human sin. But we have to be careful. Genesis itself does not name the Watchers. Genesis does not mention Mount Hermon. Genesis does not mention Azazel. Genesis does not give the height of the Nephilim. All of that comes from later tradition. So the fallen angels theory is powerful, but it also raises hard questions. Can heavenly beings produce children? Did they have bodies? How does this fit with Jesus saying angels in heaven do not marry? And if the flood destroyed the old world, why do Nephilim appear again later in Numbers? Those are serious questions. That brings us to the second view. The Line of Seth. This theory says the sons of God were not angels. They were human beings from the godly line of Seth. Cain's line is marked by violence. Seth's line is associated with calling on the name of the Lord. So in this view, Genesis 6 describes spiritual compromise. The sons of God are Seth's descendants. The daughters of men are women from the wider ungodly world, often connected with Cain's line. The sin is not angelic rebellion. The sin is the faithful line losing its holiness. And that may sound less exciting, but it is not less serious. Because sometimes collapse does not begin with monsters at the gate. It begins when people who know God stop living like they know Him. One compromise, one desire justified, one boundary erased. One generation becomes careless. The next generation thinks carelessness is normal. That is the strength of the Sethite view. It keeps the focus on human sin. And Genesis does focus on human sin. God sees the wickedness of man. God sees the violence of the earth. Noah is introduced as a righteous man in a corrupt generation. So this view fits the moral flow of Genesis. But it has a weakness. If Genesis only means Sethite men marrying Cainite women, why use the phrase sons of God? Why does the passage feel so strange? Why are the Nephilim mentioned? Why does the result become mighty men of old, men of renown? Ordinary intermarriage does not fully explain the weight of the passage. So we come to the third view. Ancient kings and warriors. What if the Nephilim were not called giants because every one of them was impossibly tall? What if they were called giants because they towered over the ancient world in power? In the ancient world, kings often claimed divine status. They acted as if they were more than men. They took what they wanted. They built names for themselves. Their monuments made them look larger than everyone else. You were not supposed to look at the king and see a neighbor. You were supposed to tremble. Genesis 6 says the sons of God saw the daughters of men and took wives, whoever they chose. That sounds like power without restraint. Then Genesis calls the figures of that age mighty men. Men of renown. Men of name. Men remembered. Men feared. And here's the part nobody tells you. The Bible is not impressed by fame. We are. We see a famous name, and we assume greatness. We see power, and we assume blessing. We see someone towering over others, and we think they must be important. But Genesis keeps turning that upside down. Cain builds a city, but Abel's blood cries from the ground. Babel tries to make a name, but God scatters it. Pharaoh sits on a throne, but the cries of slaves reach heaven. Goliath walks into the valley like a human fortress, but a shepherd boy brings him down. Again and again, Scripture asks you the same question. What kind of greatness does God recognize? Maybe the Nephilim were violent rulers, legendary warriors, men whose names became larger than life because fear made them larger. Maybe some were physically huge. Maybe some were remembered as giants because they were terrifying. Maybe their size was physical. Maybe their size was symbolic. Maybe it was both. But Genesis does not celebrate them. It places them beside corruption. It places them beside violence. It places them beside the grief of God. The world called them mighty. God saw what their world had become. Now we have to face the question on the thumbnail. Giants. Were the Nephilim really giants? The Hebrew word Nephilim is rare. It appears in Genesis 6 and Numbers 13. Many English Bibles translate it as giants. Some connect it with the idea of falling, which is why people often call them the fallen ones. But Genesis itself never stops to define the word. It does not say they were called Nephilim because. It simply says they were there. In those days. And also afterward. So we need humility. If someone says Nephilim definitely means fallen angels, they are saying more than Genesis says. If someone says Nephilim definitely means ordinary tall men and nothing more, they may also be saying too much. The Bible gives us a word loaded with mystery. And then it gives us context. Violence, fame, power, judgment. So why do people think of giants? One reason is translation history. Ancient translations connected the Nephilim with giant language. Another reason is Numbers 13. When Moses sends spies into Canaan, they return terrified. They say they saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak. Then they say, "We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers." Grasshoppers. That image is unforgettable. tiny, breakable, powerless. The spies are saying, we felt like insects in front of them. But pay attention. Numbers 13 is reporting the words of frightened spies. That does not mean the land was not dangerous. It was. That does not mean the people were not large. They were feared. But the report is shaped by fear. Joshua and Caleb saw the same land. They saw the same cities. They saw the same people. But they did not come back with the same conclusion. The 10 spies saw giants and said, we cannot. Caleb saw the same threat and said, we are well able. Same land. Same enemy. Different faith. That matters. Because the Bible is not only asking, how tall were they? It is asking, what happens to you when fear becomes bigger than God? Then the mystery deepens. The flood comes. Noah enters the ark. The waters rise. The violent world disappears beneath judgment. So if the Nephilim belong to the world before the flood, why do giant-like figures appear after the flood? Anakim, Rephaim, Og king of Bashan, Goliath. In Numbers, the spies connect the Nephilim with the descendants of Anak. In Deuteronomy, Og is remembered as one of the last of the Rephaim. His bed is described as unusually large. But even there, the Bible gives the size of the bed, not the exact height of Og's body. Then later comes Goliath, a giant-like champion from Gath. He is not called a Nephilim. That matters. But he carries the same theme. A huge warrior. A terrified army. A daily voice of defiance. For 40 days, Israel listens to the giant more than the living God. Then David arrives. A shepherd boy. No royal armor. No giant body. No sword in his hand. Just a sling, stones, and faith. David does not defeat Goliath because David is secretly bigger. He defeats Goliath because Goliath is not as big as Israel thinks. That is the biblical pattern. The giant is large enough to test faith, large enough to expose fear, large enough to make God's people ask whether the promise is still true when the enemy looks impossible. So what does the Bible actually tell us? First, the Nephilim are real figures in the biblical story. Genesis names them. It places them before the flood. It connects them to the darkest age before judgment. Second, they belong to a world of violence. They are not introduced in Eden. They are not placed in the new creation. They appear when the earth is corrupt and filled with violence. Third, they were famous and powerful. Genesis calls them mighty men of old, men of renown. Their names carried weight. Their reputation survived. Fourth, the Bible does not clearly tell us their exact origin. It does not say clearly, they were angels. It does not say clearly, they were Sethites. It does not say clearly, they were ancient kings. It gives the mystery, then moves on. Fifth, the Bible does not give their exact height. No measurement. No chart. No number. The giant tradition is serious, but Genesis itself does not say how tall they were. Sixth, the Bible does not give a neat family tree connecting every later giant clan back to Genesis 6. Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, Og, Goliath. These names are linked by themes of size, fear, warfare, and ancient power. But the exact relationship is not always explained. And maybe that is the point. The Bible gives us enough to know what the Nephilim meant. They meant the old world had become terrifying. The mighty were known. The violent were famous. The powerful were remembered. But heaven was grieved. Let that sink in. The world had celebrities. God saw corruption. The world had mighty men. God saw violence. The world remembered their names. God prepared judgment. That is the warning. Not every famous name is great in the eyes of God. Not every powerful person is blessed. Not every towering figure deserves your awe. Some giants are not signs of glory. Some giants are signs that a world has forgotten how small it is before God. So who were the Nephilim really? The most honest answer is this. They were mysterious mighty ones from the world before the flood, remembered in Scripture as powerful, renowned, and connected to an age of terrible violence. Their exact origin is debated. Their exact height is unknown. Their relationship to later giant clans is complex. But their meaning is clear. They show us what happens when power breaks away from holiness. And once you see that, the mystery becomes more than a debate. It becomes a mirror. Because we still live in a world that confuses fame with goodness. We still mistake power for blessing. We still make giants out of violent people, arrogant people, rich people, beautiful people, gifted people, and then ask everyone else to stand beneath their shadow. But Genesis will not let you worship the shadow. Genesis pulls your eyes higher. Above the Nephilim. Above the mighty men. Above the old legends. Above every giant who ever made ordinary people feel small. The giant is never ultimate. God is. So here are the 3 takeaways. Takeaway 1. The Nephilim were real figures in the biblical story, tied to the violent world before the flood and remembered as mighty ones of old. Takeaway 2. The Bible does not answer every question about their origin, height, or connection to later giant clans. Mystery should make you humble, not reckless. Takeaway 3. The deepest warning of the Nephilim is not about how large a body can become. It is about how large human pride can become when power breaks away from the fear of God. That is the real terror. A world where the strong take whatever they want. A world where violent men become famous. A world where names are remembered on earth while heaven grieves. So let me ask you this. Which explanation do you think best fits the text? Fallen angels. The line of Seth. Ancient warrior kings. Or do you think the truth is more mysterious than any single theory can hold? Tell me in the comments. And perhaps the most haunting mystery is why Genesis tells us so little about them, and yet just enough to keep the question alive thousands of years later.